So I'm standing in front of a soybean trial we had this year where we're looking at winter rye for a couple different reasons. We have a couple major problems in North Dakota in soybean production, one being glyphosate-resistant kochia. And one of the things that we're looking at to do with this study is using winter rye prior to planting soybeans in an attempt to control the glyphosate-resistant weeds. So the goal of the study was to look at the different timings and methods of removing the rye prior to or after soybean planting. We had a number of different treatments. The first one included tilling the rye in prior to planting, or we also had a treatment without any rye and soybean planting as normal. As we look across the entire experiment, there really isn't a difference between the soybeans that you can see at this point in the season. The soybeans are all maturing at roughly the same rate and at least visually have about the same number of pods and same plant height. A couple of the other mid-season treatments we were looking at in this study include spraying the rye out shortly after soybean emergence, so planting the soybeans right into the rye and then spraying them out. Another treatment includes mowing the rye at roughly the same point. We had a couple of late season treatments as well, where we were looking at spraying the rye once it reaches anthesis versus harvesting the rye off as a forage. And then we even had one treatment where we allowed the rye to grow up and mature and harvest that with the soybean crop growing amongst it as well. The study itself wound up being pretty interesting here, as one of the better looking treatments that we had as far from a weed control standpoint was when we applied glyphosate at rye anthesis in order to both as a post-emergence weed control pass in the soybeans and then also to kill off the rye growing in between them. You can see here in the row is that treatment late in the season here. We're just a couple weeks here from soybean harvest, and the rye was almost acted as a trellis during the early growing season, and then when it was sprayed, the rye just kind of fell flat between the soybean rows and really wound up with very good weed control from that treatment with just a single pass of glyphosate post-emergence. Now, one of the key benefits of having the rye is hoping for kochia suppression. And what we saw was while the rye was growing, we had anywhere from a 30 to 70% reduction in kochia population and vigor based on how dense the rye was that was planted. However, what happened was towards the end of the growing season, once the rye started maturing and dropping its leaves, the kochia sprang back to life. As you can see here, this is that treatment where we pulled the rye off as a grain when it was mature. And what's very evident here is that while the rye was growing vigorously, the kochia was suppressed and wasn't competing with the crop at all. But again, as soon as that senescence occurred on the rye, the kochia came through and now looks very atrocious. There's a lot of kochia coming through. Again, that kind of supports the idea that once rye reaches anthesis, as far as soybean production goes, that's where the benefit might end, where you'd want to get rid of the rye before it starts dropping its leaves. Now this last treatment here is where we just left the rye go toward all the way through soybean maturity. So we have both crops here. We'll harvest both of these as grain when we harvest the soybean crop. And this is just to look at what happens when there's a full season of competition between the two, just out of curiosity. The whole idea here is that we're looking to complement what we are doing with our herbicide management programs, trying to find different alternative ways to combat herbicide-resistant weeds. And at least at this point, is looking like a fairly promising avenue for limiting the amount of kochia that's growing, while also keeping in mind that you're going to supplement the rye with a 1 to 2 herbicide applications throughout the growing season.